Good morning. This is the Insight class at First Presbyterian Church, and we are in the midst of a series on ethical and moral considerations at work. And we're very happy for you to join us. We have a wonderful speaker today. It's Karl Cassel, and he's going to be talking about the Good Samaritan and addressing this theme. A little bit about Karl. He was born here in Cedar Rapids. He's had a really interesting career. He's primarily focused, I'm going to go ahead and admit a new audience participant. Karl has had a very interesting career. He's primarily focused on
How do you get your volume up? Oh.
He has been the executive director of Jane Boyd. He's the executive director of the Civil Rights Commission in town. He has formed an executive recruiting company, and he's currently involved in XPO Logistics, which has a number of projects. In fact, right now he's in Atlanta, about to return to us here in Cedar Rapids, visiting family and doing work projects there as well. Also, he's on numerous boards, including the Cedar Rapids Foundation and others as well. Karl, I want to welcome you to joining us, and thank you for joining us, and really look forward to your presentation. One more thing I should mention, we are recording this, and we have a small audience for him now, and we'll be putting the recording on YouTube, the church's YouTube site, for other people to get the benefit of hearing from Karl. So, Karl, again, welcome, and please take it away.
Thank you, Matt, and appreciate the introduction, and also First Presbyterian making this platform available. And as you mentioned, my remarks will be coming from the scripture passage of the Good Samaritan in relation to our moral and ethical treatment of people in and around our employment. And so, simply put, when I was asked to do this, I was a founder and managing partner of an executive search firm, having just come out of nonprofit. And I chose to go into that field because of the lack of diversity that I saw happening at executive levels. As it was mentioned, I serve on numerous boards and have served on numerous boards, and often you saw less diversity in the room. And so a group of us said, you know, and at the time, I was only one of two president, CEOs, or executive directors in those positions. And so you often look around and thinking, could there be more? And so, but that work fed from all the work that I've done before. Prior to that, I'm the CEO of Horizons, a family service alliance. And so, of course, we dealt a lot with seniors, delivering meals, mental health counseling, financial counseling. And we at the time, acquired a transportation service, NTS, Neighborhood Transportation Service, that helped deliver people or transport people to employment, second and third shifts. So we're talking about folks who are working second and third shift who might not have transportation. Prior to that, Civil Rights Commission, which was our charge, was the Chapter 69 ordinance, enforcing that in the city of Cedar Rapids, which prevented companies and businesses and landlords from discriminating against people on the basis of race, age, gender, sexual orientation, some of those things. And so prior to that, executive director of Jane Boyd, which now we dealt with youth development. Our main population, even though we dealt with kids all the way through seniors, our main population was our after school program, preschool age kids, and really getting them educated. And so what does that have to do with the Good Samaritan, some would say? Well, we know being called to many professions outside of our first profession, which is professing the gospel can and will create unusual tension in our lives based on where we find ourselves. But we must believe that God does not delight in our prejudice, disregard, and disrespect of our fellow man. And so when we think of what the Good Samaritan story is, and I'll use the portion in Luke chapter 10, verse 25 through 37. And I'm not going to read them all, but I'm going to read a couple lines because I want to kind of put this in context. And behold, a certain lawyer stood up and tempted Jesus, Master, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? And he said unto him, what is written in the law? How readest thou? He answered and said, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, and with all thy strength, and with all thy mind, and thy neighbor as thyself. And Jesus said unto him, thou hast answered right. This do, and thou shalt live. So, first and foremost, if the all of the law and commandments hang on the two, loving God and loving our neighbor, if we really, and I'm not expecting the world, I'm not expecting people who don't profess being a Christian to act like this, even though it'd be nice if they did. But for those of us who say this is who we are, can you imagine how different the world would be if we really walked that out? And so in light of our professions, we would even be a light in those places. So I'm going to continue just a couple more verses because I want to make sure I mention a couple people. But he, willing to justify himself, said unto Jesus, and who is my neighbor? And Jesus told a parable. And he answered him, a certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell amongst thieves. Thieves is that the first group I want to make sure that is highlighted, which stripped him of his raiment and wounded him and departed, leaving him half dead. And by chance there came down a certain priest, now someone of the religious order, that way. And when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. And likewise a Levite, who was an assistant to the priest, when he was at that place, came, looked upon him, and passed on the other side. But a certain Samaritan, as he journeyed, came and where he was, and when he saw him, had compassion on him. And so that there is the context for how we want ourselves. Who is our neighbor? Well, it's anyone and everyone. And so in work, whether it's our coworkers or for me, for instance, as someone who spent a lifetime in nonprofit, it's also the clients that you serve. And so it's interesting because I go back again to Jane Boyd and working with the children. That was important. To me, it was important work because kids were coming out of school, parents were still at work. Their kids came to the center. Their kids wanted enrichment, or the parents wanted enrichment activities, academic as well as athletic enrichment for their children. And again, we have teachers who are, for those who have been in education, we have teachers who are stretched thin. Classes are bigger. There seems to be less resources, but more importantly, there seems a need for extra services for the students that a lot of our teachers are seeing. So we're getting them after a long day in school, but what should be our charge? But also I'm employing people who aren't making a whole lot of money, but they have kids, and it's different even in the summer because now you have them from 8 to 5, but after school you have them till about 6:30 in the evening. What can we do, and who can we bring in to make sure that they're going to have a positive impact on those children, and then even the ones in our preschool? And so you look at from a moral and ethical standpoint, you're hoping these folks see their mission, however long they choose to be in this space, as someone who can really serve and lead, because they're also leading young people and then leading their peers as they're working together. So you look for those things in people. No, do they have to be Christian? No, absolutely not. But you hope they have a moral and an ethical compass that points north. Civil Rights Commission, I would say, was probably my most, I don't want to say difficult, but trying time, because you believe, as someone who grew up in Cedar Rapids, mom worked at what was Iowa Electric at the time, which is Alliant, most of her life in HR. So it was always funny running into people who were like, oh, I used to work with your mother. She was a great woman. I'm like, she's like, but then they'd always preface say, I spent a few minutes in her office at sometimes as well. So always got a kick out of that. But at the Civil Rights Commission, being charged in employment and housing enforcement opened my eyes to some of the things that were still prevalent in our society, unfortunately. And I don't think people were wholeheartedly just against people, but we all come with certain conditioning and prejudice that we hold. And so the comments that employers would make to employees, or the means that landlords would go to prevent people from moving into their units, was often mind-boggling. And so again, our charge was to take a neutral stance, listen to both sides, and render a decision. And a lot of times the decision was just a lack of communication. There's nothing here, or nothing blatant. But I was always miffed at just the openly and blatant remarks and methods that people used to use to discriminate. That was, again, I don't want to say an eye-opener like I was Pollyanna, didn't believe this stuff happened. But again, I was there from the end of 08, December of 08 through April of 2013. So what was happening at the time? Well, we had elected our first Black president. So there was a different perspective in America happening at the time. Now we look at, for 8 years, that was the case. And now the last 4, there has been a fervor in our country over the last 12 years that I think has not been the case for really openly and blatantly for about the last 40 years. And so what we're seeing is it is affecting employment. It is affecting how people move in and around housing, how people have access to capital. And so this Good Samaritan piece, to me, always lends a lesson. Now, for anyone who is who watches this broadcast after the fact and is not familiar with the Good Samaritan story, again, Samaritans and Jews were always at odds. They didn't like one another. Jews did not deal with Samaritans. They lived to the north. Hey, they're over there. And so the similarities are sometimes our neighborhoods are constructed this way, or we look at people coming from different places and often say, man, we don't want to interact with these individuals or their family members or whoever. But you have 3 people who confront the man who was beaten and left for dead. And I like what the story, what Jesus said. He calls them thieves because we have people who will rob, kill, and destroy in and around our lives. But these thieves beat him and left him for dead. And you have a group of people who have an opportunity to help. The first one being the priest. You would think, why not? Cross to the other side of the road and carried on. The Levite, who would be an assistant to a priest, but what we would just call him a CEO or someone who was a social intervener, or someone who had done work in nonprofits, something like I had. And then you had the Samaritan, who was kind of the outcast of society, chose to not just help him, take him to an inn, to an innkeeper, to a business owner, to a place where he could get rest, take care of his cost, kind of nursed him back, took care of his cost and said, if when I return, there's any more that is owed, please let me handle this. Let me write those accounts. In my life, the work that I've done, that has kind of been how I approached it. Whatever I can do to help people, the folks I employ or the folks that we serve, how can I make sure that, if for nothing else, even it's not necessarily a monetary gain, but words of wisdom or proper perspective for them to be able to carry on, because I kind of live by the mantra that we're all a candle, and we don't lose our shine by lighting another candle. And so that should be our job. And so I love the Good Samaritan story from the perspective of how should we be in our work. And so the goal basically is to make sure that if the American dream and the church ethical stance should function in the manner, or should function in this manner for all, regardless of what they have or what they don't have. And I think that's important. But there has to be that willingness for us to make sure. And so I'm going to just focus now on employment, because what I'm doing right now is I'm traveling back and forth to Atlanta. I come back on every other weekend to stay with my family, but I go back today to Atlanta to start another week. It's holiday season. XPO Logistics is doing a pop-up startup center, bunch of products, because with COVID, it has really pushed e-commerce. So they have a bunch of warehouse space that is allowing them to store products not very long. They receive them, and then the goal is to ship them out. And so we have some pretty high price clients, Sony being one. So all the PlayStation 5s, the pre-orders are coming out, but we're employing temp and seasonal employees, which there's a perspective. Now we're in Atlanta, and so the bulk of these employees are going to be seasonal or temp employees. Now I'm around other supervisors and directors of this program that are like, they really don't want to work. They're just seasonal. They'll probably always be doing this stuff. And I'm thinking, man, that might be true. I don't know that to be true one way or the other, but I am going to do all that I can to encourage them, because there'll be about 40% who will be hired on as permanent. My job is to help instruct them in the right way, but I'm around people who really are taking an entirely different approach to these individuals' development. And a lot of times, and we're, as I mentioned, going through COVID, there's a lot of companies, there's a lot of folks right now out of work. And one of the stats that I was going to mention is just here in the state of Iowa, Iowa ranks 10th, or excuse me, we're tied for 40. So we're not very high, but we are, our unemployment right now is about 10.2%. So we are tied at 40th with Arkansas and South Dakota. So if you look at 10%, so one out of every 10 people are unemployed at this point. The difference in that stat is those who are actively looking are still included in that 10%. Those who have stopped, so we know it's probably higher. So when Iowans talk about, hey, we have low unemployment, yeah, we do. But having 10% of our population unemployed and or underemployed, that, when I was in nonprofit, that helps to create attention in terms of services necessary, but also resources available to continue those services. So the people that I'm working with right now that are seasonal and or temp workers are some of these folks that I would have worked with in nonprofit or worked with their families, whether it be in childcare, whether it be them looking for housing, or as in when I was at Horizons, if they had grandparents or parents who were seniors and or need mentor financial services. It's a reoccurring theme, and all of these things are intertwined. And again, the reason I bring the Good Samaritan story is because all of us are intertwined. We are not, it's silly for us to keep functioning as if we are not our brother's keeper. We are, and we must maintain that. And so in my professional life, and this is really the first time I've worked in for-profit. You know, I did the recruiting firm, and the goal was trying to get people in. But for 15 years of my career, I've always worked in nonprofit. So maybe I bring a little softer approach in the for-profit side, which I don't mind, because again, and I'll end there and kind of open it up for questions and any perspective. But at that point, it allows me to, in my own mind, walk in people's shoes. Because I've seen it. I didn't grow up wealthy. Mom and grandma did great job taking care of us after she and my dad got divorced. But there were 4 boys, and we were around all types of people in Cedar Rapids, Grant, Wilson, and Jefferson. So I've always been a West Side kid, and being able to interact with a lot of people as a child, and even more so now as an adult, has given me proper perspective. And I refuse and encourage all, don't look down your nose at anyone. Our job is to make sure we are that Good Samaritan, and we come alongside of whoever needs our help and offer that help as best that we can. And so I want to kind of breathe there and ask, are there any questions or comments that anyone on the line would have, and something you want me to touch on?
You're right at the heart of the series that we're doing on the work versus moral considerations. I'd like to, something you said a few minutes ago about your experience in the Civil Rights Commission, and a lot of times issues were just lack of communication.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if you could expand a little on that. What kinds of communication breakdowns did you run across?
Okay, so you have, I'm an employer, and there is an employee or someone who's applying for a position, and something is said. There you go. Something is said that comes off as whether it's ageism or sexism, or they perceive it as racism. Sometimes a person was just speaking from their perspective and wasn't necessarily saying something with ill intent. That's just how it was perceived. And so when we laid it out, when information was laid out on both sides and both parties said, yeah, this was said, when you take it in its total context of how it was said, yes, it wasn't ageism or sexism or racism, but it was a lack of, it was miscommunication, or it being taken through a filter of feeling, you know what, I've heard some of this before, I'm feeling that this might be the case again. And sometimes, yes, it was, but other times, a lot more than not, we found out it wasn't.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where those miscommunications a lot of times came. Thank you for asking.
Right.
Anyone else?
I have a question, and I'm going to open up this can of worms.
Please.
Because it's been niggling at me for 20 years.
Okay.
I used to teach biology at Co before I retired.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things I taught was evolution.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things we learn in evolution is that until relatively recently in our evolutionary history, the last 4,000, 5,000 years, we existed as tribal groups, small family groups, sometimes extended families. And those families were very suspicious of anybody who was not in their family. Now, today, it's my belief that this expresses itself as racism, as classism. And so our goal in current society, and it's cropped up especially this past summer, the problem of systemic racism or endemic racism, whatever you want to call it, is not something that we can simply somehow wave a magic wand and say, it's going to go away. We're going to make it go away. You can't make it go away. The best you can do is recognize that it happens.
Sure.
And try to do something about it in yourself, in your society. But we can't just legislate it away or hope that it will go away. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, you said the last portion of you just said, you said it right. We can't hope that it'll go away or legislate it away. But again, it happens, and I use a Good Samaritan story. It happens through building relationship. If we are not willing to get involved and engage in people's lives that might be slightly different or of a different tribe, we will continue to always be at odds. And we've been good over the course of, as you talk about our evolutionary history, we've been good at making sure we've drawn a circle around us and not allowed anybody in our bubble. Over the last 50 years, we live in such an interconnected society, even more so today than ever before. Because like we're doing now, I'm in you guys' living rooms. I mean, so that's the reality. And so until we decide to really get involved in each other's lives and see that there's no monolith of any group, there's no one way of thinking in any group, we won't, in general, change our line of thinking or belief about any certain group or people. But it starts first with relationship and getting involved in each other's lives. And that's what the Samaritan did with the gentleman on the side of the road. I mean, as you're nursing him, there's compassion. But then at some level, he's able to talk, you're able to learn his story. That's the way we all should live. But we shouldn't wait till someone's hurting and downtrodden before we get engaged.
So we need to expand our definition of our tribe, essentially, expand those edges of the bubble, and find commonality, which hopefully we've been doing more and more. I think for a long time, many of us have considered ourselves non-racist, and now we're jumping into the anti-racist group and trying to be allies if possible, if we're wanted. It's not enough to just sit by and placidly accept that, well, we're not those people.
Right. Which is what we all say. We're not those people, whatever that means, but that's not enough anymore. It's really not. Spot on. So appreciate that.
Karl, can I ask you another question? You mentioned the seasonal employees, and maybe there's even more people that are doing that with COVID and the disruptions. Could you say a little bit more about what you see there? Because it seems like there's fewer people that have regular employment.
Yeah.
And obviously a lot of people are suffering because of the economic issues.
Yeah. And so we are in McDonough, Georgia, which is a southwest Atlanta. A gentleman who grew up in McDonough said, man, 20 years ago, this was all undeveloped. There was now it's just burgeoning businesses. So Atlanta has stretched out. So people are basically, this is, it looks like a large business front from the front of the building, but all of the back is storage space. It's warehouse, one of the cleanest warehouses I've ever been in. I just assume warehouses look like, down in the warehouse district. This isn't one of them, but nonetheless, all the products are coming in, will be coming in the next couple of weeks and being shipped out. But the employees are coming from in and around Atlanta. So we're talking poor Black and poor white to be seasonal and temp workers. So they're coming through a temp service. And again, poor has no, being low income poor has no color barrier, except we know traditionally poor and people of color end up in these roles. Why? Because it's seasonal. We only need them for a specific amount of time. And no, they're not as polished. They haven't had corporate jobs, or many of them haven't been involved in leadership. They've done work similar to this. There's two gentlemen that I enjoyed meeting this past week who were new. One was a former truck driver, young dude, which surprised me. He drove trucks. His truck broke down in Iowa. So when I said I was from Iowa, he's naming some small towns. His truck broke down in Iowa. And another gentleman who, dad's brother, lives in Des Moines. And so he's been here. He hasn't been here since he was like 11 years old, but he's like, oh, I've been to Des Moines. I've been to Iowa. But the perspective is most of these folks have never been out of the Atlanta area. And so now even a worldview is only shaped by all that you know. And again, the South moves, I like to say the South moves a little slower than us in the North. They're fine where they are. They stay to their families, but it's interesting. It's a lot of poor and people of color. So poor whites and people of color. And my charge there is, as I'm listening to some of management and folks that I work alongside, I call it somewhat disrespect, just assuming that will always be their lot in life. And that disappoints me just a little bit. But it is a completely different ballgame because people are working in the midst of COVID. And places like this will always need seasonal employees, but even then, they don't shut down because of COVID, because everyone's ordering things online. So the reason XPO is even doing this is because e-commerce has jumped 200-fold. And so one of the main clients coming in is Coach, which is their company is Tapestry. Coach didn't, Coach bags, Coach products, didn't ship things. You went and bought those at a local store, but they've even had to change. And so it's some of that, and you're working with individuals who, in the employer's mind, you can throw away or will always get another. They don't care about the turnover. And that frustrates me a little bit because I believe these people want to work, else they wouldn't be here, especially for some of the long hours some of them are going to do.
So much of that gap, the whole economic gap and the poor always will be poor or whatever, is an educational gap.
Absolutely. Yep. And you're exactly right, which is what I was mentioning earlier, my early days starting out in Baltimore, working at a youth center, and then bringing me back to Jane Boyd. The goal is, stress education. And not just learning what is put in front of you in school, but learning all of the things that shape our lives each and every day. It is so beneficial to be well read. And it's interesting, as we talk about education, we are coming to a dilemma. And this is, on a side note, future. We're coming to a dilemma as kids are doing online school now. My son goes to Cedar Valley. They're there every day, and I do appreciate that. But colleges are having people learn online. But we have this thing called the internet, where anything outside of basically being a doctor or a lawyer, one of those technical fields, someone could go and just get books and get all the materials they need to learn and learn it themselves. Is it going to change the cost of education? Is our education, how it's being disseminated now, is that going to change in the next 5 to 10 years based on the beta tests being done now? We can just teach people online. What's going to change the cost? It's going to change the importance, but it's also going to change, again, access. But we live in an information age where there is nothing now that I tell my kids all the time, Dad, what about, you live in the information age. Don't ask me when you have information, all the world's information at your fingertips. Don't ask me a question you can find yourself. And that becomes the dilemma that COVID has even created, or at least made apparent as we talk about education. How is education going to be constructed going forward?
But you were talking about the importance of relationship, and we don't get that on computer learning very often.
And so that even adds another dilemma. If we're viewed only through a screen, we're going to see people's hearts grow colder, and that's unfortunate. Our lives are shaped over the last 50 years. It was what was shown on television. We believe this about people or a certain group, and now we're coming to converging everything online on the internet. And so there's less. You see people walking around with their heads in their hands because they're only viewing other people through a screen. That creates even more distance between people. And that's, we should be concerned with that.
So Carl, I have a question about your seasonal employees at the warehouse. With all your background in elevating people in your positions, your nonprofit positions, like at Jane Boyd, what do you do to try to elevate these temporary workers so that they can transition, or helping them to transition to more permanent employment?
Well, and because I've been down there 3 weeks and it's brand new, I've done two things, and they're really in my mind, I'm sure, insignificant to most. But I believe if I'm there for the next couple months and they're around, this will help. One, I've got to know a lot of their stories, where you come from, what you're doing. To have someone, a female working in here that wants to be a nurse and has only taken a few classes at this point and is now working, encouraging her to get back in school, and told her, hey, if there is anyone that I can talk to on your behalf, please let me do that. Encouraging folks to read certain books, to study certain things, but just having, and so discussing with them what are some of the necessary steps, because at some level, I had people in my life that kind of helped direct me when I didn't know which way I was going. But the other piece is I'm working alongside of them. I call it an assembly line process, because whether you're making the boxes, taping the boxes, putting the product in the box, whatever it is, as a supervisor, I don't have to. But my attitude is, I don't want to just stand over here and kind of watch. That looks ridiculous. So I make sure I get in alongside of them, and that gives us ample opportunity, one, for them to see me work and try to work quickly because we have to, but also to have conversation with them, so that, because right away, once I said I'm from Iowa and I talk proper and I don't have a Southern drawl, you're already perceived different anyway. But it's created an open door, because they're like, yeah, you're kind of different. Might be smart. And I say, well, I might be. It's definitely true. And I also might not be, but I do have some things that I can pass on. And so I'm more than willing and desiring to do so. And so as I get more familiar with the area and who they are, man, if there is any way that I can help some of these individuals that you can actually see there's a spark, they just need a break. Because everyone, I remember when I first became an executive director, I tell everyone who wants to be or has desire to be, everybody started out a time CEO or executive director, as I did. But all I needed was a break, and then I was able to demonstrate competence. But as I stress to my kids, and I tell everyone that I'm around, you practice like sport. I'm a big sports guy. So your practice is usually done in the dark. When it's time to perform, we're going to see preparation or not. So you prepare when the lights are off. So when the lights come on, you have an opportunity to perform. And so encouraging them to keep doing what they're doing every day. You got to grow. As a flower, you got to grow where you're planted. So grow in this process. Whatever this is, keep growing. And it's allowing me to grow in this process as well. So we're kind of stretching each other along the way. So, but that's what I'm doing my first 3 weeks, really learning their stories and seeing how I can advocate on their behalf wherever they want to go. So thanks for asking.
You just quoted my husband's mother on her basic life philosophy. After moving 19 or 20 times with her husband's work for the railroad.
Okay.
Look where you're planted.
Yeah.
Was her mantra.
Absolutely. It's one that I use. And so, but again, I spent a lot of time with my grandmother. So little things like that, I heard those things and I've just kind of sewn in my heart and I use. It comes off corny, but I think when we stop and think about the simplicity of life, that's really it. So people stop and like, okay, yeah, there's some validity there. That makes sense. So yeah, she was smart. She told you right.
We should probably wrap up here in a minute or two. Carl, any last thoughts or maybe one more question if somebody has one?
Yeah. Look at my notes to see if I had anything that I wanted to add, because I didn't stick to my notes and I usually never do. That's why I didn't want to do a PowerPoint or do a slides, because I hop all over the place. But there's nothing else in my notes I want to mention. But if there's any any questions or comments anyone wants to make, please.
I had a question. So you've been in Cedar Rapids 3 weeks now?
No.
I've been back. I grew up here, but I'm in Atlanta. I've been in Atlanta 3 weeks consistently.
When you were in Iowa, did you work with the immigrants from Africa, and you have any insights into their community and how they're doing with the pandemic and everything else?
Yeah, so a little bit when I was on the recruiting side, Matt said I was born in Iowa. I wasn't. I was born in Monrovia, Liberia. So my dad and uncle came as students here. My grandfather was a lawyer and a judge, and they convinced him to let me come. So at age 3, I came to Iowa. So I have a heart for immigrants, just so you know. And so I wear a bunch of different hats. And when I talk about walking in people's shoes, I can. So I know there was a group, and my wife, bless her heart, she's the director of the African American Museum here. So during derecho, my wife and another female, we live on the west side, there are apartments over behind Westdale, and there's a bunch of African immigrants who didn't have anything. They made food upon food and brought water for like a stretch of 2 weeks over and over and over. And so it's things like that she didn't have to. After the first time, that was it. But her going to this apartment that had no power, kids would run up to her and her friend and be like, "Oh, the food ladies are here." And that's what it was. But it was that population who many of them live there and are not being properly dealt with. They had folks that gave gift cards. So my wife and her friend basically started a push to make sure these folks had food. So during the month of August and the first part of September, that's what they were doing for the immigrant population.
That group at the apartment building that had most of its roof torn off, where are they living now? Do you know? And
You know, I would have to ask my wife if she's kept up. I don't know. And that's where I'm hoping our nonprofits have really gotten involved because housing and shelter was an issue because some of those apartment complexes, they didn't have a roof or they were leaking. There was no power for weeks on end, and they were just making do. But I'm not sure where they're living now. And having been gone literally for the past month, only coming back for a couple of days, it's almost funny. I feel very disconnected from Cedar Rapids and never felt that way in the last 16 years of being here. But I will check and I would encourage you guys just inquire as well. But I will check because it's probably good we do check up on those individuals.
I don't really expect you to be their spokesperson. Sorry if I indicated that.
No. But I think finding out, out of sight, out of mind. So what you did is you reminded me, Carl, somebody needs to check. If there's
It took so long for people to even realize that they were living in tents because
absolutely.
none of us had power.
Absolutely. Yeah, we didn't have access to
for
it.
a while. Yeah.
So true.
And I just heard the other day that the Catherine McCauley shelter has reduced capacity right now because they're still rebuilding after derecho. Yep,
absolutely. And that's what nonprofits are going through, and the lack of resources, people giving. It's going to change a lot. And now it's starting to get cold, and people are going to need housing, and also going to just need heat and food still. So, and COVID is, yeah.
Thank you very much, Carl.
Thank you.
Learned a lot, and really appreciate your joining us today.
I enjoyed this. Thank you guys for having me, and best of luck going forward with the rest of the series. And yeah, Matt, if you wouldn't mind sending forth links and things but I'll go back to the page as well because I'd like to hear what other folks have to say.
Great. You can, I will do that. I'll just remind people that maybe are listening that on the First Presbyterian website, they go to the Insight class section. There's a link to kind of the entire archive of Insight classes, at least since we've started doing them by video.
Okay.
But I will send you that link. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
I think one reason we don't have too many attending today was that link still had last week's date on it.
Yes, that's now been fixed, but yeah, there was an issue there. But I think that what we're learning is that we have a fairly small group participating in the Zoom meeting, but maybe a somewhat larger group actually watching it after the fact. But it's good to have a few people and have some conversation going. I think it makes it a little bit more peppy for people, even if they're just watching it after the fact.
Absolutely. So thank you guys for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Carl.
Very much. We've
Thank
enjoyed
you,
it.
Matt.
All right. Good day.